Now, it's time for Modern Money Doughnuts with Stephen Hale and Gabrielle Bond.
Hello and welcome to the second episode of Series 3 of Modern Money Doughnuts, a podcast about modern monetary theory and ecological economics, which is now being produced by Modern Money Lab here in Adelaide, South Australia, on the land of the Kaurna people. And we pay our respects to the Kaurna people and to their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that this land was never ceded. I'd like to pass you over now to my co-host, Gabrielle Bond.
Hi, Stephen. It's great to be back with everybody. Yes, as Stephen said, we're broadcasting on the Modern Money Lab YouTube channel today. And we are going to be talking to one of our amazing students in the Economics of Sustainability postgraduate course, Nathan McMillan. And our theme today is going to be about framing and language, particularly around the deficit myth. So really looking forward to chatting to Nathan about that. But before we introduce Nathan, I just wanted to mention the intro video was made for this show by the good folks at KRTD Media, and to thank them very much for doing that beautiful piece of work for us today that we use on our show. And also the music from that video was played by my partner, the concert pianist and mathematician, Alexander Hannis, and he has a YouTube channel as well. If you want to look him up, you could Google for his last name, which is pretty unique, Hanys, and you can find lots of his stuff out there on YouTube, some really beautiful little clips, including that one of the Moonlight Sonata. So yeah, thanks Alex very much for the use of that music. It's great. Great, so I'm going to introduce Nathan now, just to add Nathan to our live broadcast. Hi Nathan, can you hear us?
I can. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for coming. So Nathan, you're studying in the Economics of Sustainability Master's degree at Torrens Uni. I wondered if you could just start by telling us a little bit about your background and what made you decide to come and study with us.
Sure. So my background education-wise was originally just an undergrad in economics and political sciences. And then work-wise, since then, I've had a career in the public sector in the great state of New South Wales, doing somewhere between finance and bureaucracy.
Yep.
Coming on 8 years now.
Okay, excellent.
Modern money theory.
Yeah. How did you get into MMT?
COVID.
Okay.
Everyone needed a hobby, and I figured, why not this? But okay. I think it was a article in the Guardian or the ABC. I can't quite recall, where they sort of pitched the underlying principle of MMT, and it just didn't feel, it didn't click with the way I knew the world worked. And that was enough to get me to search out a little bit more. And then you start digging, and frankly, I haven't stopped since. That was probably 3 years ago. So
So you did a conventional economics degree. Do you feel like you've had to unlearn a lot of stuff that you were taught at uni?
Well, yes. Thankfully, I don't think a lot. It was quite some time ago, and I haven't really used it in practice since. So hopefully, a little bit of that slipped on in its own time without me having to physically unlearn it. But I think I'll find that I'll have to learn a bit more unlearn a bit more as our current studies go on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does challenge some pretty fundamental assumptions, doesn't it? Like, I think now might be a good time to tell people we've had a bit of a discussion group going in between our trimesters of teaching, where we meet up early on a Thursday morning, super early for me, way too early. It's like 7:30 in the morning. And we've been talking about framing and language, in particular in relation to the deficit myth. But also we've started talking about how we might frame the ecological side of what we're teaching as well, about economic growth. And I would love for you to say what we were chatting about before in the live broadcast, Nathan, about MMT being like the toolkit, and the way you explained it was perfect.
Right. So so we sort of this conversation we'll be having just with all the students. We talk about framing, and there's a lot of it's about messaging as well. And I think we're all coming from very different positions. Because I came across as being interested in MMT, and then I'm sort of learning more about the ecological side of stuff while I'm here, which is very serious, but very important. There's a lot of different kind of perspectives on how we should go about talking this, and I think a lot of people conflate the two. I know it's in the course title, but the way I see it is MMT is the opportunity, MMT is the vehicle which could unlock the potential, and then the ecological economics, such as, say, the donut model that's been gaining popularity, that's the destination.
Absolutely. And I really like the term sustainable prosperity, because that encapsulates the donut in kind of with those two words together. To me, do you feel that is a good overarching description of a destination that we all share?
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to argue with that, isn't it? You can't turn around and say, no, I want unsustainable prosperity. There's no. You're not going to get any pushback on that. If that's enough to open the door to get people to listen to a little bit more, that's enough to open the door to get people to sort of start paying attention.
Yeah.
Can we just remind people briefly, because they might not all know what the donut model is, that it's just there is an inner ring to the donut, which is based on the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, loosely anyway, which is about identifying all those things people need access to if they're going to have a decent quality of life. And then there's an outer ring, which it's good to talk about this today, because one of the two scientists who were the main people behind the 9 planetary boundaries, which is the outer ring of the donut that we need to stay within or move within if we're going to live sustainably in the future, was the great Earth systems scientist, climate scientist, Will Steffen from ANU, who very sadly passed on a couple of days ago and will be very badly missed. And so they're in between those two rings. That's where you want to be if you're going to be in what I think Kate Raworth in her book Doughnut Economics refers to as just and sustainable space, meeting people's needs while remaining within the means of the planet. Sorry to interrupt. Just a little bit of background.
Somewhat important information. Yeah. I find a lot of people, I think, start the conversation, like different audiences will respond differently depending on where you start the conversation. I know for a lot of people, economics and politics, I wind up looking up your course because I basically talked to everyone who'd be willing to listen to me about MMT and trying to convince them of that. And then when no one wanted to talk to me anymore, I figured, hey, maybe I should make something of this. So I think a piece of paper behind it. But there's you get very different reactions for different audiences if you walked up and said, we want sustainable prosperity, healthy growth, versus if you said, this isn't, the way our finance system works is not how they're telling you it works. The implications. I mean, mostly on this end.
I saw something really interesting on Twitter. Somebody had posted a picture of an American $1 bill, and it said, "Don't you find it strange that people think that if I, as a person, make one of these, create it myself and start spending it, I could end up in jail, whereas the government needs to get it from me before they can spend it." Isn't that incongruous?
I normally start with I normally start by talking to people about posing a question like where'd the dollar come from? And eventually you say, oh, the banks, where they get it from? Oh, well, the government gets it from us. So where that then, and eventually you wind up at the Reserve Bank, someone with a keyboard or with a mint.
Yeah.
And then the next question is, all right, how come we're out of money? Or some sort of topical issue just to get them thinking about how it doesn't compute.
Yeah. I think one thing that helped it click for me as well was being told that, and I guess we'd have to fact check this, but I'm pretty sure that it's true, that if you, in the US at least, if you paid your taxes in paper money and you paid it at the post office, rather than passing it on to the government, it would simply be shredded.
Yeah.
Is that an urban myth, Stephen, or is that actually true?
Sorry, I'm mute. It's sort of true. I mean, they look at when notes go into the banking system, those that are tattered do get shredded, yes, but it's not the notes that are important. Of course, they're just a token. They represent, Warren Mosler would say, a tax anticipation note. As far as the federal government is concerned, they are technically an IOU of the federal government, just the way a government bond is. It's just if you are holding physical currency, they don't pay interest on physical currency. But absolutely, and I was in at the first MMT conference in Kansas City with Phil Long in 2017, and we got a taxi actually to go to the Kansas City Fed, because one of the branches of the Federal Reserve is in Kansas City, where they gave us for nothing a bag of torn up old notes. And we explained to the taxi driver, a very intelligent woman, I can't remember what qualifications she had, but she did have some educational qualifications. She had, this is going off the point slightly, but she had never earned in her life the Australian minimum wage. But anyway, we explained what we were going to get at the Kansas City Fed, and she said, "Oh, that's terrible. Imagine all the people you could help with that money if they didn't tear it to pieces." Which just showed me, here's a really intelligent woman, and she has no understanding at all of the monetary system. That's typical, I think.
I'm the first person. I'd be happy to be the first person to stand up and say there are plenty of people smarter than me. But from where I sit at the moment, a whole bunch of people are very foolish. And all of this, I think, again, with the MMT stuff, it doesn't mean anything to people until you bring it home as to how it affects their lives. So, if I say because I'm still a student, if MMT is right and, perhaps raising interest rates isn't the best way to control inflation and may in fact be contributing to inflation, great, that's an issue. But also, if you say that's why, if your neighbor just lost their house because interest rates went up and they couldn't afford it, or if that business closed and everyone's out of a job because interest rates up and they can't afford it, now people are interested.
Absolutely. I wouldn't say most people are foolish. I think people really shouldn't have to pay close attention to how the monetary system works. But it is, I'm afraid my profession has played quite a big role in misleading people. And that goes back to framing, because it is so easy when people are not paying close attention to fall victim to all the heuristics and biases that we know that frame our thinking. So substitution bias, if we're asked a question about public finance, we naturally think in terms of our own finances. That's the misleading metaphor. And then unless somebody explains how things actually work to us in an engaging enough way, and we can actually be bothered to listen, then that's the way, particularly when it's being reinforced all the time in the media, in the Australian Financial Review, again, only yesterday, not that I want to refer to that particularly. It is difficult. The framing issue is a difficult one. We've made some progress over the last 10 years, but much of that progress has been, I think, down to one person. It's been down to Stephanie. She's been so effective getting the message over.
Yes, that's we can still use the household analogy. You just need to add think of the budget like a household, except you've got the only printing press in town and a private army to make sure everyone needs to pay some taxes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was reflecting last night. I watched some of the videos that they shared from the Robo-Debt Royal Commission, which, if you're in the US, I'll just very quickly sort of outline as best I can what happened there. The Australian government decided to use a now discredited and actually illegal method of calculating people's income that were on welfare, that did bits and pieces of work in between, as you do, and created these automatic debts on thousands of people that they then got chased by debt collectors. And it was a complete, it ruined people's lives. It actually cost people's lives, having these fake debts against you when you were receiving Commonwealth income. And all of that's coming out now about the legal issues around it. But what really shocked me quite a lot yesterday was watching the person explain the media strategy around how they deliberately made these, they basically flooded the media, the mainstream media, with stories about welfare cheats, and isn't it great that the government crackdown is bringing all this money back. And
you might need to say a little bit more if there's non-Australians listening, Gabby, for them to understand what the Robo-Debt things
Didn't
was about.
we then wind up making that guy Prime Minister?
Yeah. What is Robo-Debt, or what was Robo-Debt, Gabby?
So Robo-Debt was a means for the Department of Human Services, which administers the welfare payments, to calculate the money that hypothetically people on welfare received that they weren't entitled to, and it did it by averaging their income that they reported and assuming that they earned a certain amount spread across the whole year, rather than kind of adding up fortnight by fortnight. And so people
basically, it was misleading, and it made people out to owe money to the federal government, which they didn't. And then there didn't seem to be any way that it could be put right.
And there's some parallels between that approach and the sort of the mainstream economics commentary as well, isn't there? Where it's what you're fed is a bunch of numbers at the end of an equation, and what's missing from that is the context. You're just shown a correlation and told it's causation. In this case, obviously, there's a bit of a different story to it. There's more to it, but
yeah, absolutely.
Even on a day-to-day.
But for people out there listening to know that the money that was recouped from these people, it didn't need to be. It's not a zero-sum game that money coming back from those people, if it didn't come back, then we couldn't afford this other thing over here. That kind of adds that extra layer of cruelty onto the whole process, which is already incredibly damaging and tragic for the people involved.
Now, I'm going to challenge you on this, Gabby, and I'm going to say that if you want to talk about MMT, you don't talk about any of that. Because I think there is, again, depending on what audience you're talking to, and I think the progressive side of politics and people who are more aggressively inclined are already more on board with this sort of stuff. But if you're trying to reach the larger portion of the population, as soon as you start talking about welfare debts and you start talking about, so the jobs guarantee is a good example. If we start talking about the jobs guarantee as a welfare program or something that is targeted to people who, as a handout, now you're a welfare system. So all the negative connotations that come with that, dole bludger, all that sort of stuff. Why should I give up my taxes to pay for yours? I know, strictly speaking, under MMT, that's not true, but the effect is the same on the population. So if you're saying, I prefer to phrase it in such a way as a opportunity and B, it's about giving people who want to work an opportunity. I heard and you can package that up in something like, say, a civil service.
So it's opportunity on both sides, really, isn't it? Work needs doing, people need work.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not about giving people who are otherwise unproductive something to do. It's about giving people who want something to do the means to do it. So getting people into the workforce. But there's a great example. Oh dear, his name escapes me. Who's the lead economist in the Australia Institute?
Richard Dennis?
Yes, he did a great example between two public sector institutions we have here in Australia, one being Centrelink, which handles the bulk of welfare payments for civil society, and the other being Veterans Affairs, which is more or less the same function, but specifically for veterans. Exactly the same function, completely different, approaches. If you ask people about them, completely different approaches. Generally speaking, if you're going into Centrelink, there's a lot of shame attached to that. If you're going into Veterans Affairs, there's a lot of honor attached to that, rightly so. But that's a great example of how, if you start talking about the jobs guarantee, which is, the inflation stabilizing mechanism, as a means of getting people, for moral reasons, the wrong moral reasons, or like the moral reasons that you're feeling a motive to, in the basket of welfare, then I think automatically you've just put up a huge wall that you have to now break down to get more people on board. If we
thank you for raising that. Thank you for raising that, because that's partly why I was really excited to talk to you, because we talk about these things amongst our students as well, and you always have such good perspectives to add, and it's reminded me of hopefully people aren't reading that backwards, but Don't Think of an Elephant by George Lakoff. This is the earlier version, but there's another a later version that's come out more recently as well. And that, the idea of demonizing welfare recipients versus, lauding the people who are receiving veterans' affairs benefits from being a veteran is a really good case in point, I think.
If you I think there is a genuine opportunity for this to be implemented through sort of a civic service style thing. So in Australia, we, say you're not dress it up, but just make people perfectly aware. Put it into the space of your volunteer fire services. Put it into the space of your volunteer, your volunteer emergency services. If you think about it as an institution like that, I think that makes a lot more sense, and is a lot less. It's a lot harder to tear down than if you did, these people don't have a job, let's give them a job, because that falls into the welfare bucket, and that's a much, pick your fights.
Yeah, that's right. And so a couple of good examples from that would be the Commonwealth Employment Services that we used to have back in the 60s, 70s?
Right up to the 90s.
Okay.
Actually, yes, but I think it's Nathan's discussion of this is absolutely correct. I think it's important to bear in mind that what we're trying to reframe has been framed the way it is at the moment deliberately over a period of 40 years. Nathan is not old enough to remember this, but I can remember the 1970s I was in the UK, but it was similar, if not more the case in Australia, that if you were on unemployment benefit in those days, it was not framed the way it is now. It's not always been the way it is now. We are at the tail end of a 40-year campaign to demonize welfare payments in general. It's not how they started off in the 50s, in the 60s, and even the 1970s. But we can't go back to where we were then. So as Lakoff would say, we need to reframe things. And the way Nathan was talking about framing a job guarantee, I think that's a good case in point. Having a positive frame for a program, and also the participants of a program, the self-respect and respect of the community as a whole, people are choosing to go into that program and provide valuable services to the rest of the community.
My understanding is that our federal government at the moment is looking at considering a service to sort of fill the role somewhere between your SES at the moment. Disaster management. Disaster relief is what I'm getting at. So at the moment, every time we have a disaster, we call in the army, and that's very expensive, very inefficient, and obviously we all know the disasters are going to happen more frequently and get more severe. But that's sort of space where there's a new service being generated, which is going to be, that just screams jobs guarantee opportunity to me. That screams like that's the sort of space where jobs guarantee should be, piloted in some way, shape, or form.
Absolutely. And Australia has a really proud culture of volunteering. And if we can tap into that, I think lots of people, pretty much everybody would say, oh, yes, I do at least some volunteer work and I'd like to do more. It's part of what binds us together, especially like you said, in times of disaster. And it's friends and neighbours and communities that
That's a difficult space, of course, because there are people who do voluntary work who would see it differently if they were paid for it.
Yes, but there's paid charity positions. It's easy to ask someone, do you think there's something that needs doing in your community? And if they say no, then maybe we've gone too far. But the chances are they're going to say yes, and then you can work on that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're not short of ideas. And Gabby's a campaign group produced a really good report on a federal job guarantee in Australia only last year.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it was actually, that's right. Last year in around about August, in time for the Jobs Summit, that the new Labor Party, newly elected Labor Party held, which was going to be a full employment summit, might I say. The original framing of that summit was as full employment, and we thought, oh, excellent, now's a good time to start talking about a job guarantee. And then it kind of gradually drifted into the more sort of wishy-washy skills and employment and skills. So I think we have, we still have some work to do with framing that in a way that appeals across the board. And I think your ideas are fantastic, Nathan. And just before we finish up, I was hoping we might get to framing about economic growth as well, but I think we've probably run out of time today, so for another day. But I wondered if you could tell us a bit about the conversations that you've been having, Nathan, about framing the deficit myth and framing a job guarantee, and what or how you've gone about it, and what you think is the best options for those conversations.
Yeah, so look, I'm conscious we haven't got too much more time, so I'll be brief.
No, that's all right.
I think when we're sort of getting these students together and having these conversations, it becomes very apparent that everyone is fully aware of all of the budgetary sort of analogies for how we're going to run out of money, how the finances are in limited capacity, the household budget, the public debt, the fiscal deficit, whatever, the black hole. Yeah, all those ones. And then the ecology stuff is the part we're trying to get people to pay attention to, and yet that's always treated as if it's in mainstream economics, it's kind of treated as if it's a unlimited resource, or because we don't have stuff like it doesn't pop up in budgets. You have the budget, and then you have a separate report for ecology and environmental impacts.
Yeah, or it's kind of sort of clumsily referred to as something like ecosystem services and dollar values are putting onto things. But it's the barrier. It's the thing that's getting in the way of the budget. So it's, if you're a policymaker and you're not particularly environmentally inclined, you need to get around that, and it's separate. It's not part of the stuff that you're I'm going to say KPIs. It's a very poor term. But I think there's a lot of capacity to pick up all of the budgetary sort of lingo that everyone's so familiar with and apply that to an ecology budget. So, for instance, we've been drawing down our ecological account or our environmental account, and now we're overdrawn, and that's the impact you're having, and that's where we're seeing we need to put back into that, or we need to stop taking out of that. But you can just pick up everything that we've been saying with the budget, the financial budget,
and apply it to ecology. And I think that's a separate conversation from how you go about tackling the MMT side of things, because now we're talking about the destination, not the means. But then, you have to figure out how to break down that welfare, the household analogy as well, in mainstream news on the finance side of things. But
so essentially what, going back to what you said before, it's like we need to flip the script. So the ecological side is limited and in danger of being used up to the extent that it creates massive problems for us, whereas the financial side has capacity to get us to the destinations that we need.
Yeah, absolutely. So that financial side, I think we need to have a conversation around inflation. I think now's the time to do it with inflation going so crazy, because again, it's affecting everyone. And a lot of people, not in a small way. And if you stand up, there is a better way to do this. I'm not saying it's easy, but if you stand up and say there's a better way to do this, I think now's got to be the time. I think historically that'd be true as well. Times like this would be change.
One thing I've heard Stephen say when we've met with union folks and people who, are basically sort of, you might expect them to be on board with a job guarantee as an idea, but just keep raising what could go wrong. I heard you say it really, really well, Stephen. You said, well, we run a government school system. We run a government health system. No, they're not perfect. And yes, they need improvement. But for most people, most of the time, they're a fantastic resource. And why couldn't we run a government employment system and run those things?
Absolutely. And of course, in the US, they use the same sort of argument about a health system, about Medicare for all. It would be ignoring the rest of the world.
It as an expense rather than an investment as well.
And a bureaucratic nightmare. Whereas in almost every other high-income country in the world, it's not easy to run, and there are inefficiencies in health systems, of course. But everybody else, if we're thinking about budgetary impacts for that matter, everybody else around the world has a much more efficient health system than the US does. Spends about half what US does out of its GDP on healthcare, and has a greater life expectancy. So there are a lot of myths, which different sets of myths, although there are obviously similarities, but they're not exactly the same set in every country around the world, and we need to take them on. And part of us doing that is actually bringing together people like Nathan and Susan, who we're going to talk to next week, and Jeff, who we talked to last week, from different countries and with, although many things in common, different backgrounds too. So we can learn from each other and encourage each other to go out and challenge those myths. It's not easy though, but it is something where the more and more people that we have who are in a position, whether it's in the Labour Party or the Democrats in the US, or in financial institutions, media organizations, academia, wherever they are, challenging these myths and reframing the conversation, the better. It took the Conservative side 30 years after the Second World War to undo many of the advances, many of the gains which were won after 1945. And I think we don't really have 20 years to achieve these things. That's the downside. But I think we're maybe 10 years into a pushback.
I read if you walked into that room and asked everyone if they wanted a whole bunch more apprentices, given the way the construction industry is going off in Australia at the moment, it would have been a bit of a different conversation. But
yeah. Well, we need everybody's got a slightly different approach, but if we're all pushing in broadly the same direction, bearing in mind we've all got different audiences too. If you're talking to a bunch of Conservatives about a job guarantee, there is a way to make it appear attractive to them. People who complain about, wrongly, absurdly, about dull budgets, well, if you give people the opportunity of contributing and having a worthwhile job, then if if we're talking to greenies like Gabby, and give people the opportunity to work in a way which supports the community and defends and restores the environment. If you're talking to union leaders, well, if people have an alternative to insecure, very low paid jobs, they're going to have more bargaining power, and you ought to find it easier to recruit them for your unions, actually. For every audience, there is a different message. Those messages don't contradict each other. They are about framing, and I see no reason why we can't be successful with a movement towards a federal job guarantee, because actually there's a strong positive frame for almost everybody. We talked about it. It's just a good idea.
That's true. And I think...
Sorry, again, you go.
That's all right. No, I was just going to mention, the idea of a well-being budget and a well-being economy. And I think we are seeing a bit of a swing back towards, away from greed is good and more towards, hey, let's look after people, which obviously appeals to my values. It may not appeal to everybody, and I get that. And I'm trying to teach myself more about trying to put myself in other people's shoes and see it from other points of view. Not that it is always easy, but I've found our discussions as a group of students, I'm not a student, but I'm tagging along, has been incredibly inspiring and given me some real kind of meaty problems to mull over and sort out in my own head.
That's probably a reasonably good way. We'll give Nathan the last word in a minute, but that's a reasonably good way to wind up after we've given Nathan the last word.
Indeed.
I'll end on a good note. I'll say that I do try and hold little community talks on this for everyone who's willing to listen. And it is reassuring that once people see it, they don't unsee it. There's a light bulb moment, and then once they see it, you can change people's perspectives on this, and it does stick. So
that's terrific.
Great. That's really
Thank
good.
you very much, Nathan. If I could say, before Gabby says goodbye, if I could just say to everybody, if you have never heard of Professor Will Steffen, then Google Will Steffen and have a look at one of his talks on the Anthropocene or on planetary boundaries. He is, he wasn't an Australian, but he for a long time was at ANU in Australia, and one of the most important scientists of our time, who will be very sadly missed. And many of us owe him an enormous debt of gratitude for his work.
Yeah, thank you. Good note to end on. Thanks, Stephen. All right, well, thanks very much, Nathan, for being with us today. It's really super interesting to hear your perspectives. And we'll see folks again next week when we talk to the inimitable Susan Borden, who has been one of the leading lights in our conversations about framing as well. Susan is, I just think she's really cool and interesting.
And has a cool link to the very famous economist Karl Polanyi. We can ask her about that next week.
Yeah.
Great. She's got some interesting takes on the role of the metaphor as well, if you get the chance. But anyway.
Yeah, excellent. Great. All right. Well, we will see you next week. Same time, same channel. Bye,
everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Nathan.